Welcome to Cultures of the Future lectures promoted by CETAPS. CETAPS is a Center for English Translation and Anglo-Portuguese Studies hosted by the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University of Porto and by the Faculty of Social and Human Sciences of the Nova University of Lisbon. CETAPS is a dynamic research center that brings together more than 100 senior and junior researchers with the common purpose of promoting research with high national and international reach. Cultures of the Future Lectures is CETAP's latest initiative, which, by inviting prominent scholars from all over the world to present original perspectives within our fields of research, aims to offer innovative tools to reflect on and possibly imagine a better future. This is the second part of Professor Jennifer Wagner-Lawlor's lecture on the force of gender. Wagner-Lawlor is Professor of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies and English at Pennsylvania State University. She is a former president of the Society for Utopian Studies and has published prolifically in the field, namely two thought-provoking monographs, Postmodern Utopias and Feminist Fictions. She is the author of dozens of book chapters and articles in utopian studies, feminist studies, and contemporary women's writing. More recently, she co-edited with Fatima Vieira and Peter Marks the Palgrave Handbook of Utopian and Dystopian Literatures, and she is currently working on plasthetics, a term that incorporates the study of plasticity as a trope and the hermeneutics of plastic artifacts in literary and artistic texts. In the second part of the Force of Gender lecture, Jennifer Wagner-Lawlor will delve in Margaret Atwood's world with the afterlife of the Handmaid's Tale Payback. Thank you and welcome.
This section is entitled The Afterlife of the Handmaid's Tale Payback. While Marge Piercy's Woman on the Edge of Time offers a more complex accounting of gender, class, and race rooted in capitalism's ruthless logic, it also offers, like Russell's The Female Man, a vision of a sustainable and pleasurable, if fragile, world. Margaret Atwood's contemporaneous classic, The Handmaid's Tale, 1985, continues to resonate nearly 4 decades on as its original portrait of American ultra-right theocratic dystopia seems even more possible today in 2022 as the Supreme Court has struck down a woman's right to choose. The scholarship on this novel is extensive, yet for all its undoubted brilliance, a persistent political critique of the novel is based on in the eponymous handmaid's passivity in the face of violence and toward the possibility of resistance. Ironically, the women's own critique of second-wave feminist dreams of a women's community packs its own punch. Of her feminist mother, Offred will ask, "Is this what you wanted?" as she contemplates her existence in the concentration camp of fertile women in the government of Gilead has set up as a natural and national resource. The long afterlife of this novel is likely attributable to its willingness to face an apparent absence of alternatives by, as China Miéville puts it, embracing our not-togetherness and acknowledging the potential force or indeed the reality of both hatred and violence in advancing the work of utopia. If the novel falls short in terms of women's political agency, it's another story in the 4 and soon-to-be 5-season Hulu production of The Handmaid's Tale that opened on April 26, 2017. What the series particularly highlights is Atwood's longtime interest in the concept of payback, as articulated in her 2007 Massey Lectures at Harvard, and published as Payback, Debt and the Shadow Side of Wealth in 2008. This treatise is about obligation and ethics more than economics. This is a quote from Atwood. Simply the way human beings have thought about what is owed, who owes it, and how it should be repaid. The balancing of the scales in religion, in literature, in the criminal underworld, the revenge tragedy, and in nature, from her introduction. The moral complexities of Atwood's concept of payback are no more colorfully on display than in the Hulu series, for which the author is executive producer. The increasingly explicit violence of the Handmaids, led by Atwood's heroine, Offred, made some viewers uncomfortable enough to stop watching. But Atwood herself argues that her work, whether in The Handmaid's Tale itself or in her later speculative fiction works, she argues that she invents nothing that is impossible. The scenes of violence in the novel and the cable series, Atwood has observed, do not represent anything that human beings have not already done to one another or wanted to, and the technological triumphs and disasters of the Mad Adam trilogy introduce nothing that science has not already begun working on, and in many cases has already achieved. It remains to be seen whether in the 5th season of series on television, the revenge trip that Elizabeth Moss's Offred and remaining handmaids are on can lead to any more humane or hospitable social vision. The Handmaid's Tale was always about more than one kind of choice, but even the Hulu update could not make up for the novel's inattention to the fictional foundations of sex, gender, and race as social categories. The same is true of many of the numerous contemporary novels that take on the sexist utilitarianism of equating the female body with a walking womb, including Hilary Jordan's When She Woke, 2011, Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God, 2017, Naomi Alderman's The Power, 2017, Jenny Malamed's Gather the Daughters, 2017, Lainey Zumas's Red Clocks, 2018, Bina Shah's Before She Sleeps, a novel, 2018, Kim Liggett's The Grace Year, 2019, Joanne Ramos's The Farm, 2019. Most of these novels are at least a good read, while many lack the precision and intellectual craftiness of Atwood's meditation on gendered risk, responsibility, rights, and restitution, even as those other texts, those other novels, are promoted in reviews and on book jackets as, quote, modern updates of The Handmaid's Tale. Naomi Alderman's The Power is among the best of these, and indeed Atwood herself evidently encouraged completion of the manuscript. In the novel, young girls on the verge of puberty suddenly manifest a new power emitted by, quote, an organ of electricity, end quote, that connects via rope-like cables from the collarbone. The tissue has, quote, electroreceptors enabling, they theorize, a form of electric echolocation, end quote, that directs the flow of energy from the women's fingers. Manipulated properly, the power makes for rather thrilling sexual foreplay that is also, however, easily fatal should the woman become careless, angry, or just bored. Billed as our era's Handmaid's Tale by the Washington Post, the power picks up and strengthens the threads of Atwood's payback theme to create a near-present world as disturbing to read about as the later Hulu episodes of The Handmaid's Tale are to watch. The novel stands up well against such earlier gender reversal novels as Catherine Burdekin's At the End of This Day's Business, 1935, but first published in 1989, or Sherry Tepper's The Gate to Women's Country from 1988, in which women in authority are more than a force to be reckoned with by subservient men who resent women's special knowledge and secrets, as well as their social superiority. Women are the force of social control, denying education and free will to most males. A sort of role reversal story showing that power can be a tool of oppression for women as well as men. But it's not a novel whose author colors far outside the lines. National Book Award winner Louise Erdrich published Future Home of the Living God, also in 2017. Set once again in a near present in the years since 9/11, the U.S. Patriot Act has been gradually strengthened and broadened in scope to control library and medical databases, quote, in order to protect national security, end quote. In one swift blow, the federal government empowers itself to surveil fertility records, quote, to determine who is pregnant throughout the country. This is actually something people are really afraid of right now in the United States, post Roe v. Wade. And to round up the women into, quote, gravid detention centers, end quote. The book jacket assertion that Erdrich, quote, captures the essence of The Handmaid's Tale is a little misleading. Erdrich's always exquisite prose and plot construction is buoyed by the mixed-race heroine's access to the ontological and epistemological resources of both Christian and indigenous spirituality. In her precisely dated journal, the protagonist, named Cedar, never descends to the abject despair of Offred, for example, as even as she too finds herself at the historical confluence of environmental decline and falling birth rates, government breakdown, and reactionary backlash against women's freedoms. Cedar's grounded spirituality, while appreciative of mystery, is also critical and pragmatic, directing her actions even in the most difficult moments. This is a quote. "Now is all we have, I tell myself. Work on the now, the here-ness, the present, the moment of extreme hyper-awareness, which is also linked to Sarah, her mother, to Sarah's most profound mental exercise, her meditation, which is something I have trouble with. I am more comfortable with the beforeness or the afterness of life," end quote. Cedar, both non-white and economically marginal, has perforce paid more attention than Offred to, quote, the blank white spaces at the edges of print. That's a quote from Atwood. Offred realizes only too late that the white spaces were filled with an invisible ink. Cedar is reported and captured, but her belief in, quote, a God who sides with the wretched, one willing to share the misery, end quote, keeps her working toward escape. Ultimately, Cedar's baby is born on Christmas Day. Quote, "For once in my life, I am right on time," Cedar writes. But the Christian echoes behind the promise of a future home of the living God, which is a text of a highway billboard that Cedar sees, and is, of course, also the title of the novel, leaves only dubious hope. As in The Handmaid's Tale, the infant is, quote-unquote, pried away. We're not sure whether to be raptured up, to be adopted. We don't even know if the child is actually alive. Afterwards, Cedar appears to be dying from, quote, a damaged heart that she blames on her medical treatment. She is not the only living thing running out of time. The final entry reminisces on the time before the world began to change and snow disappeared. Quote, "Whiteness fills the air, and whiteness is all there is. I am here, and I was there, and I have wondered ever since your birth, where will you be, my darling, the last time it snows on earth," end quote. No Christmas miracle, but a whiteout. Cedar entertains no vengeful us and them fantasies, remaining faithful to a spiritual commitment to the living word, redefined, quote, "Not the word uttered by God to make life, but by the baby who recognizes the being on whom life depends," quote, "that is, ma, ah, oh, mama, mother." And Cedar then writes after that, quote, "I know the word. It is the oldest word in any language, first utterance." Erdrich opens her novel with a dedication to her own daughter, whose name means light of my days, and also followed by a quote from Hildegard of Bingen, quote, "The word is living, being, spirit, all verdant greening, all creativity. This word manifests itself in every creature," end quote. In an interview, Erdrich discusses her early experiences of spirituality and magical thinking, matured into a respect for traditional Ojibwe ceremony and rituals. But she clarifies that, quote, "I hate religious rules. They are usually about controlling women. When it comes to God, I cherish doubt," end quote. To be clear, my point in this section is that I harbor doubts myself about the viability of apparently feminist texts whose plots are structured by an insistence on what Kiteri de Beauregard calls, quote, "the canonization of maternalism," end quote. When what we are shown over and over again is the inability to think past the gender binary, which represents itself as a kind of impasse insofar as it ties women only to the primary care work of parenting. I agree with de Beauregard's assessment of what we have called feminist utopias as being hamstrung by a, quote, "fundamental challenge," end quote, in feminist thought, one anticipated by Wendy Brown and Jacques Derrida decades ago, that feminism depends on an essentialist notion of the feminine identity. Even South African author Lauren Bucas, whose 2020 novel Afterlife is publicized thus, quote, "Think Children of Men meets The Handmaid's Tale," end quote, disappoints in this regard. Bucas' story features a new emergent virus that presents first as with flu-like symptoms, but turns into prostate cancer, proving fatal to nearly the entire population of the globe. The protagonist, Nicole, and her pre-puberty son, Miles, are South Africans visiting, I should say white South Africans, visiting the United States, but prevented from leaving when the virus takes hold and becomes epidemic in nature. Several billion have died already, and the tiny percent of males who prove immune are placed in sort of concentration camps where they are milked, as it were, and that's a term used in the novel, of the most precious natural resource. And now the United States is intent on hunting down any male who is on the loose. To maintain his freedom, Miles becomes Mila, though the adolescent stirrings of his penis make the ruse increasingly difficult. They are able to hide in plain sight as robed nuns of a newly created religious sect, the Church of All Sorrows, clearly reminiscent of Atwood's Handmaid centers and second-wave feminist separatist movements. But in the end, the escape of mother and child is effected by an organization that once upon a time helped American women escape domestic violence, another version of what a commander in Atwood's tale had jokingly called the Underground Frail Road. And Nicole and Miles make it back to Africa, which, like many once so-called developing countries, ironically proves more resilient to contemporary forms of economic and social adversity and more respectful of individual freedom, even that of a young white male. Still, it's hard not to think that the same forces of black market profiteering off of the capture and distribution of semen, which Miles had to defend himself from in America, will not take root on the African continent as well. We can appreciate Bucas's play with racial dynamics and her skillful plotting as well as her characteristic wit, but one might have hoped for, and even expected from this author, a dubiously optimistic conclusion. Perhaps the cultivation of doubt helps account for the often original and increasingly dominant line of speculative contemporary writing by African American and African writers. Typically linked with Afrofuturism, these texts have proven and still prove to be far more hospitable to defamiliarizing narrative narratives entertaining genderqueer and racial others. The richness of American utopian and speculative writing at an historical moment when the very survival of quote, life itself, American or otherwise, seems ever more insecure, signals the important work to be done in imagining otherwise. In 1993, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower develops the tenets of the Earthseed movement and includes statements such as this, quote, civilization is to groups what intelligence is to individuals. And so you note that this idea of intelligence and civilization goes all the way back to the Gertrude Short story, Visitor from Venus. Civilization is a means of combining the intelligence of the many to achieve ongoing group adaptation. Civilization, like intelligence, may serve adequately, or fail to serve its adaptive function. When civilization fails to serve, it must disintegrate unless it is acted upon by unifying internal or external forces, end quote. So it's the protagonist of this novel, Lauren Olamina, sees the oppositional nature of biopolitical struggles as, quote, no more intellectual than two rams knocking their heads together, a form of stupidity. Making a future for a dying civilization, as Zua posits, demands not simply work, but intelligent work. And in a 1999 interview appended to later editions of the novel, Butler describes a common theme to all her novels. Quote, our problem as a species results from our having two inherited characteristics that don't work and play well together, especially since the wrong one is in control. The two characteristics are intelligence and hierarchical behavior, end quote. Olamina's middle name, Oya, is a river deity in Africa. She's unpredictable, and this is actually Olamina talking about her middle name. Oya is unpredictable, intelligent, and dangerous, a good namesake. And such a figure becomes the earth seed deity of change, a power, and intelligence. These are all names that Olamina gives to her sort of religion or philosophy, she can't decide which it is, of Earthseed. And this critical intelligence is one that refuses to accommodate the willed ignorance of those hanging on to the ways of the world. And her father's in this category. At one point she said to him, yeah, it's not going to be the world is not going to end. Your world is going to end. So as in A Visitor from Venus, such a refusal is viewed as civilizational immaturity. For Butler's Olamina, Earthseed is adulthood. And that's a quote, Earthseed is adulthood. This means, practically speaking, that Earthseed as a philosophy or as a practice is not interested in gender or in race per se, except as constructions of a dominant hierarchical system that must be rejected. Olamina takes each person as they are, equally qualified to teach and learn, that's a quotation, and also equally responsible for and to each other. Gender and race are functionally irrelevant insofar as each individual has the clarity of mind to put aside their assumptions, indeed to put aside anything from the past that will no longer serve. Like Zua, Olamina understands her function as a sort of messenger or conduit, but also as a free agent. In fact, Octavia Butler observed that she had only written one quote-unquote utopia story, which imagines no community at all, but just sort of free agent that Gertrude Short's alien intelligences forecast. Her story, The Book of Martha, features a figure, protagonist, named Martha, but a figuration of Butler herself, as a Black woman and working novelist who is suddenly transported, maybe in a dream, she's not sure, to some non-place of, quote, endless grayness, in which God greets her, quote, with a weary smile, end quote. He, she, God appears as, over the course of the novel, as actually all of those, as a male, as a female, as just a kind of a voice, right? And God gives Martha a very particular task. You will help humankind to survive its greedy, murderous, wasteful adolescence. You'll give them a better chance to survive than they've given themselves. I'll lend you the power, and you'll do this. When you finish your work, you'll go back and live among them again as one of the lowliest. You're the one who will decide what that will mean, end quote. Like her biblical namesake, Martha shoots back that she's always been among the low, in that she was born Black, in poverty, to an uneducated, addicted mother. And she wonders aloud why she was chosen for such a task, quote, so poorly defined, so impossible, end quote. The conversation continues around this idea of her freedom, her work, free will more generally, and how to identify the one thing that can improve human existence, given her, that is Martha/Butler's, considerable worlding skills reflected in her successful novels and stories. Martha's eventual decision is to give humanity, quote, the only possible utopia, dreams, powerful, unavoidable, realistic dreams that come every time people sleep, much more realistic and intense than most dreams are now. I mean, the satisfaction should be in the dreaming, not in the trying to make the dream real, end quote. God understands the rationale. Quote, real power will be less satisfying, so fewer people will be driven to try to conquer their neighbors or exterminate their minorities. All in all, the dreams will probably give humanity more time than it would have without them, end quote. This time, God points out, will afford humans the chance to, quote, grow up a little, or at least find some way of surviving what remains of its adolescence, and of attaining a species maturity that might reject the lure of, quote, bad but attractive leaders, end quote, destructive habits, and willed ignorance of, quote unquote, looming disaster. In short, humanity might become more intelligent, more self-critical. Martha fine-tunes her solution. The dreams should be at once very pleasurable, but also able to, quote, teach, or at least promote, more thoughtfulness and concern for, quote unquote, real consequences. Quote, I want them to enjoy themselves as much as while they're asleep, but be a lot more awake and aware when they are awake. A lot less susceptible to lies, peer pressure, and self-delusion, end quote. Not a perfect solution, but God agrees, quote, it will help more than it will hurt. Make the dream happen, Martha concludes. The richness of this modest proposal is extrapolated in one of the best American novels of the last 25 years, Toni Morrison's Paradise, which embraces tightly the not-togetherness of an Oklahoman African-American community dating from the Reconstruction era. By 1976, so 200 years after independence, the original racial utopia is rotting from the inside. The us and them attitude of Ruby, Oklahoma is defined not only by a racial binary, but also by a sexual one. As far as the male leaders of the town can see, quote, everything that worries them must come from women, end quote. But the narrator describes, quote, a backward place ruled by men whose power was out of control, end quote. The novel's utopian counterspace is the so-called convent of women, out-of-place souls who haphazardly congregate and find a quote-unquote real home in the middle of nowhere, with its leader, Consolata, who is described as an ideal parent who, quote, locked no doors and accepted each as she was, end quote. The depth and complexity of this novel is impossible to describe here. Suffice it to say that by embracing America's not-togetherness, Morrison reckons with forces of sexism and racism in such a way as to promote a standpoint of critical intelligence, a new intelligence or in-seeing that might actually pry apart the double bind of American life. As I've argued, the endless work of Utopia in Paradise is its insistence that we divine other sources of wisdom rather than drinking from the same tainted waters. Morrison's convent dwellers undergo a ritualistic, intersubjective transformation of identity as they, quote unquote, step in to one another, emerging each time revised, that's a word in the novel, revised in such a way that their suspicious ruby neighbors perceive, quote, a sense of surfeit, the charged air of the house, its foreign feel, and a markedly different look in the tenant's eyes, social and connecting when they spoke to you. Their adult manner, how calmly they themselves they seemed, no longer haunted. The former accusations directed to the dead undone by murmurs of love. The living God in Connie's convent, quote, did not thunder instructions. He was a liberating God, a teacher who taught you how to learn to see for yourself if you stopped steeping in vanity's sour juice and paid attention to his world, end quote. Of course, Morrison is not taken in by the appeal of a happy ending. The novel ends as it began, with the massacre of the convent women, the bitches, quote unquote, more like witches, end quote, by Ruby's men. That said, the novel teaches us, asking us to hearken to the kind of alienating intelligence that Short's story introduced. Morrison asks us not to seek escape routes, but portals that refuse, quote, positions that are closed, and instead, quote, in my own imagination, opening doors to all sorts of things, or stepping into, as the novel puts it, the dreams of others. Paradise is a wonderful book, to my mind, one of the best novels I've ever read, period. But it's Octavia Butler, rather than Morrison or even Le Guin, who most fully imagines an opening up to the truly other and what might be either lost or gained, or, well, I should say, might be lost and gained. It is still hard to find a more alien and also sensuous version of desire and sex than in Butler's novel Imago from the Xenogenesis trilogy, in which the alien Oankali, who arrive on Earth in order to preserve both themselves and the human race, understand the fatal flaw of, quote, a mismatched pair of genetic characteristics in the human body. Quote, you're intelligent, he said. That's the newer of the two characteristics, and the one you might have put to work to save yourselves. You are hierarchical. That's the older and more entrenched characteristic. We saw it in your closest animal relatives and in your most distant ones, when human intelligence served it instead of guiding it. When human intelligence did not even acknowledge it has a problem, but took pride in it or did not notice it at all, that was like ignoring cancer, end quote. But the Oankali speaker here, Jaya, points out they are interested in this cancer and would trade for this genetic human material because cancer is a sort of alternate model of reproduction, which is more like genetic engineering. Quote, we're not hierarchical, you see, we never were, but we are powerfully acquisitive. We acquire new life, seek it, investigate it, investigate it, manipulate it, sort it, use it. We carry the drive to do this in a minuscule cell within a cell, a tiny organelle within every cell of our bodies, end quote. This cancer drive offers possibilities, Jaya explains. Quote, regeneration of lost limbs, controlled malleability. Future Oankali may be much less frightening to potential trade partners if they're able to reshape themselves and look more like the partners before the trade, end quote. And in that genetic trade, humans will change too. Much of the trilogy's plot revolves around this kind of prospect of change. Some humans see a form of aggressive species colonization. Others in the novel, however, become fascinated and even committed to the possibility of this change, this healing, as it is proposed, of the human body, and thus of human society, indeed of human nature, quote unquote. Thank you.